Good evening. Today is the sixth day of the month of February, and we are continuing to salute Black history by reading the Equal Justice Initiative Reconstruction in America. Chapter 6 is a truth that needs telling. This is a discussion or a writing about the terror and massacre and violence that our African American ancestors faced between 1865 and 1877. A truth needs telling. A truth that needs telling. As the egalitarian spirit of post-Civil War America evaporated under the desire for national reunification, Black Americans, simply by existing, served as a problematic reminder of this nation's failings. White America dealt with this inconvenience by constructing a savagely enforced system of racial apartheid that excluded Black people almost entirely from mainstream American life, a system so grotesque that Nazi Germany would later take inspiration from it for its own racist policies. And of course, we read about that when we read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And this piece is from Nicole Hannah Jones's 1619 project, which we also read on the Black Man's Read Aloud Hour. If Reconstruction had been a largely understudied period of American history, the racial terror that Black people suffered during Reconstruction is nearly absent from the public memory. The deadly attack Black communities endured in the first years of freedom and the institutions that tolerated that violence laid a foundation for the era of racial terror and lynching that followed, and the segregation and inequality that endures still. Even as we have fewer details, retain less documentation, and know the names of fewer victims of Reconstruction era violence than of the later periods, we cannot learn the lessons of Reconstruction's failures or comprehend the legacy of that violent trauma until we confront the devastation it wrought and the challenges the public narrative have that deny the truth of their past. In 1863, the Negro was granted freedom from physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation. But he has not been given land to make the freedom meaningful. At the same time, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the Midwest and West, which meant that the nation was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor while refusing to do that for its Black peasants from Africa, who were held in slavery 240 years. And this is why Frederick Douglass would say that the emancipation for the Negro was freedom to hunger, freedom to the winds and rains of heaven, freedom without roofs to cover their heads. It was freedom without bread to eat, without land to cultivate. It was freedom in famine at the same time. It was a miracle that the Negro has survived. Martin Luther King, 1967, when he began his journey towards reparations. The Union prevailed as victors in the Civil War, but white Southerners and supporters of the Confederacy won the narrative war by distorting memory of the conflict in the Reconstruction period that followed. In the South, Reconstruction was largely documented as a vengeful period in which Northern political interests imposed illegitimate rule upon Black dominance on a beleaguered but determined white South that ultimately regained its rightful claim to self-rule. As early as 1866, Edward Pollard's book, The Lost Cause, praised the Confederate Rebellion as a constitutional and noble cause. The view was soon a civil religion embraced throughout the white South by clergy, political leaders, and social organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was founded in 1895. Today, thousands of Confederate monuments across the United States serve a function more potent than simply honoring the dead or recounting historical events. Those installed around the turn of the 20th century aim to invent historical fact by romanticizing and glorifying enslavement, valorizing those who fought to preserve it, and reframing Southern secession as an honorable effort to defend local autonomy and states' rights. The men were right who wore the gray, and right can never die, reads an inscription on a Confederate monument at the Colbert County Courthouse in Tuscomia, Alabama, erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1911. The monument includes a prayer: God of our fathers, help us to preserve for our children the priceless treasure of the true story of the Confederate soldier. In his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, W.E.B. Du Bois described white Southerners' Reconstruction narratives as deliberate and unbounded attempts to prove a case and win a dispute and preserve economic misery and political domination by besmirching the character, motive, and common sense of every single person who dared disagree with the dominant philosophy of the white South. Du Bois continued, one cannot study Reconstruction without first frankly facing the facts of universal lying. Monuments to the Confederacy were installed generations after the Civil War. The activity quickened in response to the increasingly successful mid-20th century campaign for African American rights and equality, a period some have termed a second Black Reconstruction. To oppose the civil rights movement, Southern states, elected officials, and organizations defending white supremacy used public displays of Confederate ornography and anti-Reconstruction rhetoric to defiantly signal an ongoing resistance to racial equality. During 1938 proceedings of a proposed federal anti-lynching law, Senator Claude Pepper read into the constitutional record a telegram message from the Florida governor, Fred P. Cone, who opposed the use of federal law to prosecute lynching in the South, had read, "We do not want to return to the shackles of Reconstruction days upon the backs of our people." Like every other federal anti-lynching measure proposed during the era of racial terror, the lynching bill failed. In 1950, the Louisiana Department of Commerce and Industry elected an historic marker in the vicinity of the 1873 Colfax Massacre. Its inscription claims that the violent attack by white mobs that left 150 black people dead ended carpetbagger misrule in the state, justifying racial violence rather than memorializing its victims. When Attorney General Robert Kennedy came to Montgomery, Alabama in 1863 to urge Alabama Governor George C. Wallace to end his opposition to school desegregation, pro-segregation white protesters placed a Confederate Memorial Day wreath over the brass star marking where the Confederacy's president had taken the oath of office 102 years earlier. A note left at the wreath explained this intention to keep any enemy from standing on the star where Jefferson Davis was inaugurated. It was signed, "Unreconstructed." The distortion of the past is made possible through the incomplete telling of the story. A narrative that casts white society as Reconstruction's persecuted victim and the end of Reconstruction as just and proper. Southern triumph can only prevail through the silencing of the black experience. When we listen to the voices of the black men and women who witnessed the hope, the promise, and terrifying danger of the era, and when we probe the haunting descriptions of the brutality that killed so many, we cannot deny the tragedy of post-Civil War era's missed opportunity to remake our nation's racial order. Nor can we ignore the black victims whose death and trauma have long been overlooked in the dominant public telling. Today, in the midst of the 150th anniversary of the Reconstruction period, organizations and institutions are working to tell a fuller story. While the American Civil War is well represented within the national park system, and has been commemorated for over 100 years and has received immense attention throughout numerous books. National Park Superintendent Tim Good wrote in 2016, Reconstruction is not represented at all within the national park system. Its events have never been commemorated, and it has never received far less attention from scholars than its immediate predecessor. The National Park Service in 2015 announced an initiative to develop curricula, launch sites, and dedicate resources to establish a national narrative of the Reconstruction period. In May 2016, that work yielded first fruit when the National Park Service partnered with a coalition of community leaders in Memphis, Tennessee to erect an historical marker documenting the 1866 Memphis Massacre in a city within multiple Confederate monuments in a park named for Ku Klux Klan follower Nathan Bedford Forrest. This effort marked the first publicly funded historical commemoration of the massacre. The National Park Service efforts have continued and expanded to other states and communities, including a national monument in Beaufort, South Carolina. 2 years after opening a memorial to victims of racial terror, lynching, and a museum exploring the narrative links between enslavement, lynching, segregation, and mass incarceration in 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative dedicated a memorial to black men, women, and children murdered in racial attacks during the Reconstruction era. This memorial features the names of 500 documented victims and the locations of 34 documented massacres, but it is also dedicated to the thousands of additional documented victims whose names were not recorded, and the many, many more unknown victims who can never be quantified. Facing horrific violence black Americans suffered during Reconstruction forces us to recognize the fierce legacy of white supremacy in this country and the terrible means used to defend it. This critical history challenges us to be unsatisfied with solutions to injustice that go no deeper than the surface, and to remember that the fight for justice is a long and ongoing struggle. By memorializing the victims killed and acknowledging the white supremacist violence that devastated the entire black community in the first years after emancipation, organizations, government agencies, and individual communities work to tell a story of Reconstruction that centers the black experience of terror and trauma and magnifies the remarkable survival story African Americans have managed to build and still in perfect freedom. According to my way of thinking, Abraham Lincoln done a good thing when he set us free. Rachel Adams, a 78-year-old black woman, said it in the 1930s during an interview at her home in Athens, Georgia. Jess Davis, he was all right too, because if him and Lincoln hadn't gotten to fighting, we would have been slaves to this very day. It's mighty good to do just as you please, and bread and water is heaps better than that something to eat we had to slave for. And before I end, I wanted to read one piece, the massacre that occurred in Eufaula, Alabama. During the Civil War, Eufaula, Alabama was once a Confederate stronghold, the commercial center of Balboa County and home to more black people than white. After the emancipation, ratification of the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights for black men. This empowered Balboa County's new black electorate to end white supremacist officials' control over the county. In 1870, black voters helped elect Elias Keels, a white candidate who supported the aims of Reconstruction, to the position of city court judge. 4 years later, when Keels ran for re-election, local white residents determined to regain political dominance in the county used terror and intimidation to suppress black votes, ultimately waging a deadly massacre that left dozens of blacks dead. As the 1874 election neared, white employees openly fired any black worker who intended to vote for Keels. False rumors spread that Black residents planned to violently drive white voters from the polls, and white residents began stockpiling guns near Eupholia's polling sites. Seeing the threat of the election day violence, killers tried to notify state and federal officials of the danger. But Alabama's Attorney General rebuffed the warning, and A.S. Daggett, captain of the federal troops stationed in Eufaula, claimed that it would violate his orders to use federal troops to protect black voters. Despite the risk, hundreds of African Americans marched to downtown Eufaula polling site on November 3rd. Some were immediately arrested and jailed on fraud accusations. Around noon, several white men forced a black man into an alley and threatened to arrest him if he did not vote against civil rights. Black witnesses protested and a pistol was fired. White people claimed the black man had fired a shot at them, while many black people insisted a white man had fired a shot into the air. Soon afterwards, a large mob of white men retrieved stockpiled guns stored nearby, gathered in the streets and in the upstairs windows of the surrounding buildings, and fired indiscriminately in the crowds of mostly unarmed blacks. Within minutes, 400 shots had been fired, leaving at least 6 black people dead and injuring as many as 80 people. Many survivors fled, including an estimated 500 black people who had not yet voted. One black man who survived later recalled that when the shooting stopped, he heard the white crowd cheer, "Hooray for the white man's party." Later that day, a white mob attacked another county polling station in Spring Hill, Alabama, where Killis was the election supervisor. The mob destroyed the ballot box, burned the ballots inside, and killed Killis' teenage son. Newspapers described the violence as a riot, but a congressional representative later characterized the attack as a massacre. Sentiments published in the local press praised the attack. "Big riot today, several killed and many others hurt, some badly, but none of our friends among them. The white man goose hangs high, 3 cheers for Eufaula." Although the identities of many white perpetrators of the massacre were known, no white person was ever convicted. Instead, a black man named Hilliard Miles was convicted and imprisoned for perjury after identifying members of the white mob. Decades later, Braxton Bragg Comer, whom Mr. Miles had named as a perpetrator of the massacre, was elected governor of Alabama. The Eufaula massacre in its aftermath showed black residents that exercising their new legal rights, particularly by voting, made them targets for deadly attacks, and they could not depend on authorities for protection. The result was mass voter suppression. While 1,200 black Eufaula residents voted in the 1874 election, only 10 cast ballots in 1876. That legacy remains today. Today, the population of Boboa County is nearly 50% black, but white officials hold 8 of 12 elected county positions. In 2016, the county had the highest voter purge rate in the United States. During Reconstruction, black voters lost their lives in Eufaula, and many more were disenfranchised because they supported pro-Reconstruction Republican candidates who pushed for black citizenship rights at a time when white supremacy dominated the National Democratic Party. This division would continue until major party alignments during the 20th century civil rights movement. Today, public memory of Reconstruction violence in Boboa County is reduced to one historical marker erected in 1979, which describes the election riot of 1874 as a bloody episode that marked the end of Republican domination in Boboa County. In downtown Eufaula, the streets where black voters were shot down for voting more than 150 years ago now host a towering Confederate monument erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1904. S.H. Dent, a former Confederate soldier who witnessed and possibly helped commit the massacre, spoke at the monument's unveiling. And that is the end of the reading. Violence, massacre violence, white mob violence, murder and mayhem forced by white mobs, white individuals against our black ancestors during the period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Next, we will move towards violence after Reconstruction. Take care. Have a great day.